She hugged me tighter and longer than a woman who saw me twice a year had any right to, and when she finally pulled back, there was a small brass key pressed into my palm, cold and completely unexplained. "Don't tell your mother," she whispered. "Not yet. You'll know when." Then she smiled like nothing had happened, picked up a paper plate of potato salad, and walked off to referee an argument about lawn chairs, leaving me standing in the middle of my family's backyard with a stranger's secret suddenly warm in my fist. I'm Ivy. And that key would end up unlocking a lot more than a storage unit. The Callahan family reunion happens the second Saturday of every July, rain or shine, in my Uncle Bruce's backyard, which is really just my late grandmother's backyard with a new name attached to the deed. It has happened every year of my entire life, minus the 2 years it didn't, for reasons everyone in my family understands and nobody discusses out loud, the way families do with certain years. There are, roughly, 4 constants at every Callahan reunion. There is a folding table sagging under the weight of 7 variations of potato salad, because nobody communicates in advance and everybody, independently, decides potato salad is their contribution, a running joke that has become so entrenched that one year my cousin brought a sign for the table that simply read "Potato Salad Row," and nobody has had the heart to retire it since. There is my cousin Whitney holding court near the drink cooler, performing a version of her life that is roughly 40% more successful than the actual one, which I know because Whitney and I follow each other's exes on social media out of pure spite and I have receipts going back a decade. There is my mother, standing slightly apart from every conversation, the permanent posture of a woman who spent 30 years being the family's designated worrier and never quite learned how to stop, drifting from group to group with a paper cup of lemonade she never finishes, always half a step outside whatever circle she's technically standing inside. And there is my Aunt Vivian. Aunt Viv is my grandmother's youngest sister, which makes her something like a great aunt, though nobody has ever called her that to her face, because Aunt Viv has made it clear on multiple occasions that great aunt makes her sound like a piece of antique furniture, and she would prefer to be addressed like a person who is still, in her words, actively alive and occasionally dangerous. She is 81 years old. She lives 40 minutes outside of town in a house that used to belong to my great-grandmother, alone except for a cat named Norman who I am fairly sure hates everyone but tolerates her specifically, the way certain cats select exactly one human being to bestow their grudging affection on and treat the rest of the species as furniture. She comes to exactly one family event a year, this one, stays for precisely 90 minutes, and leaves before dessert, a pattern so reliable my cousins used to set watches by it as kids, timing how long until Aunt Viv makes her exit, a running bet that, at various points in family history, has actually involved real money changing hands. This year, she arrived at 2:15, same as always, wearing a straw hat with a ribbon that matched nothing else she had on, same as always, and made her way through the yard greeting people with the specific, efficient warmth of someone budgeting exactly 90 minutes of social energy and rationing it carefully, the way you might ration the last of a good bottle of wine across an evening you know is going to demand more of you than you'd like. When she got to me, though, something was different. She hugged me the way you hug someone at an airport, not a backyard, the way you hug someone you're not sure you'll see again, arms tight, face pressed briefly into my shoulder even though she's a full head shorter than me, holding on maybe 4 full seconds longer than the moment called for, long enough that I actually felt my own arms start to loosen in confusion before hers finally did. And when she pulled back, that's when the key appeared, pressed into my palm with a small, deliberate motion, her fingers folding mine closed around it like she was tucking a secret into an envelope and sealing the flap with her thumb. "Don't tell your mother," she whispered. "Not yet. You'll know when." "Aunt Viv, what is this, later, sweetheart?" She was already smiling her regular reunion smile again, already turning toward the potato salad table, already becoming, in the space of one breath, the version of herself that 90 minutes of family gatherings required. Enjoy the party. I stood there, key digging faintly into my palm, and watched my 81-year-old great-aunt pick up a paper plate like nothing at all unusual had just occurred, chatting easily with my Uncle Bruce about his tomato plants, and I understood, with the specific certainty you get maybe 5 times in your whole life, that something important had just happened to me and I had absolutely no idea what it was. I opened my hand once I was safely behind the garage, away from the crowd, tucked into the narrow strip of shade where the recycling bins live and nobody ever thinks to wander, and looked at it properly. It was small, smaller than a house key, closer to the size that opens a mailbox or a jewelry box, old brass gone slightly dull with age, the edges worn smooth in a way that suggested decades of handling, someone turning it over and over in a pocket or a drawer, unable to quite let it go and unable to quite use it either. No tag. No note. No context whatsoever, aside from the specific, deliberate way it had been placed in my hand and the specific, deliberate instruction that had come with it. A faint number stamped into the flat top, worn nearly illegible but still readable if I tilted it against the light, 114. No tag. No note. No context whatsoever, aside from the specific, deliberate way it had been placed in my hand and the specific, deliberate instruction that had come with it. I found myself scanning the yard for Aunt Viv, half expecting her to be watching me from across the crowd with some knowing expression, but she'd already resumed her usual reunion choreography, a few minutes with Uncle Bruce, a polite exchange with my mother that from a distance looked exactly as stilted as it always did, the two of them standing a careful 3 feet apart with the specific, practiced politeness of people who've learned to coexist without ever quite resolving whatever sits between them, a brief, oddly formal handshake with Whitney's husband, whom she has never liked and has never bothered to hide it, delivered with the tight, closed-mouth smile she reserves specifically for him and, as far as I've ever noticed, absolutely no one else. 90 minutes later, on schedule, she left. I watched her walk to her ancient blue sedan, the one she refuses to replace despite my Uncle Bruce's annual, futile offer to buy her something newer. That car's been sitting in the family longer than half the people at this party, he always says, and she always laughs and tells him the car has better manners than most of the people at this party too, and I almost, ran after her across the yard to demand an explanation on the spot. But something stopped me. Some instinct that this wasn't a conversation for a driveway, sandwiched between goodbyes, with my mother possibly in earshot. Whatever this was, Aunt Viv had chosen her moment carefully, the hug, the whisper, the specific instruction not to tell my mother, and something told me the explanation, whenever it came, deserved the same care, the same deliberate timing, rather than being dragged out of her in a rush between a hug and a car door. So I let her go. I stood in the driveway with a key in my pocket and watched her taillights disappear around the corner, and then I went back inside and ate a piece of my Uncle Bruce's slightly too dry lemon cake and smiled and made small talk and did not, for the rest of that party, say a single word to anyone about what had just happened, though I caught my own hand drifting to my pocket at least a dozen times over the next 2 hours, checking, half-consciously, that the key was still there. By the time I got home that night, key sitting on my nightstand where I could see it from bed, I had convinced myself of at least 11 different explanations, none of which I found remotely satisfying, and I lay awake far longer than I should have, running through each one like a woman counting sheep that refused to jump the fence quietly. Okay, say the whole thing again, from the beginning, and don't skip the part about the hug, Georgia said, already pulling her laptop toward her across my kitchen counter, phone wedged between her shoulder and ear even though she was sitting 3 feet away from me. a habit she's had since college that I've never understood and never bothered to question, some vestigial reflex from years of multitasking through law school study sessions. Georgia has been my best friend since we were assigned as roommates freshman year and discovered, within the first week, that we were both the kind of people who reorganize a stranger's bookshelf if left alone in their apartment too long. She works as a paralegal now, a job that has given her an encyclopedic, slightly unsettling knowledge of estate law, wills, probate disputes, and every conceivable way a family can implode over inheritance, all of which she considers, at this point, less a profession and more a personality trait, something she brings up unprompted at dinner parties in ways that occasionally alarm people who don't know her well enough yet to find it charming. I told her everything. The hug, the whisper, the key, the number 114, the specific instruction not to tell my mother. George's eyes lit up in a way I recognized immediately and found simultaneously comforting and alarming. Okay. This is a safe deposit box key, she said, with the flat, immediate confidence of someone who has seen this exact shape of key attached to this exact shape of family drama more times than any reasonable person should have. Or a storage unit. 90% of the time, a small numbered key like that, handed over secretly at a family event, with an instruction not to tell a specific relative, that's a safe deposit box. It's the paralegal equivalent of a Sherlock Holmes deduction, Ivy. I promise you, I could probably testify to it in a deposition. And the other 10%? Storage unit. Sometimes a locker at an old social club, but those are mostly gone now, sadly. They used to be a goldmine for this kind of thing. Occasionally, and I want to flag this as a real possibility, not just me being dramatic, a key to something your aunt doesn't legally have access to anymore, which she's handing off before someone finds out and takes it away from her. I had a case 2 years ago where an elderly client had been quietly holding on to a deceased sister's storage unit key for a decade because she couldn't bring herself to either empty it or admit to the rest of the family it still existed. That's an oddly specific 10%. I've seen some things, Ivy. Estate disputes make people do strange, secretive things. And 81-year-old women who whisper, "Don't tell your mother," at family reunions are, statistically, exactly the demographic most likely to be sitting on 40 years of quietly guarded family secrets. It's practically a genre at this point. I put my head down on the counter. This is my life now. I have a mystery key and a paralegal who's treating it like a season finale. This is basically a season finale. Ivy. Think about it. Your family has been weird about something for as long as I've known you. You've literally told me before there are 2 missing years nobody explains at these reunions. Your aunt shows up once a year like clockwork, leaves before dessert every single time like she's got somewhere more important to be, and has apparently never liked Whitney's husband for reasons nobody's ever spelled out. And now she's handing you keys in secret and telling you not to tell your mom? Ivy, this is not a coincidence. This is a woman who has been sitting on something for decades and just decided the clock ran out. I hated that Georgia was probably right, because it meant I was going to spend the next several days unable to think about anything else, which is exactly what happened, the key sitting on my nightstand every night like a small, patient question I couldn't stop hearing. I should explain the 2 missing years, because Georgia was right to flag it, and because it matters for what comes later. When I was 9, my family stopped going to the reunion for 2 consecutive summers. Nobody explained why at the time, I just remember my mother saying, both years, in the same clipped, final tone, "We're not going this year," and something in her face that made it very clear the topic was closed before it opened, a door shutting so fast I never even got a proper look at what was behind it. By the 3rd summer, we went again, and it was never discussed, And I grew up simply absorbing it as one of those unspoken family facts you don't question because questioning it clearly costs someone something you can't see, the way children learn, long before they can articulate it, which rooms in a house are safe to walk into and which ones aren't. I'd asked my mother about it exactly once, at 17, during a fight about something unrelated, curfew, I think, or a boy she didn't approve of, some ordinary teenage grievance, that spiraled, the way teenage fights do, into every grievance either of us had ever quietly filed away over the years. What actually happened those 2 years? I demanded, some reckless, cornered instinct pulling the question out of me before I'd fully decided to ask it, and my mother had gone very still, very quiet, the anger draining out of her face and leaving something more tired behind it. "That's not my story to tell you, Ivy," she'd said. "Ask your Aunt Viv, if you ever want to know badly enough." I never had. Partly because the fight blew over and the moment passed, the way teenage crises do, swallowed up by the next week's more urgent dramas. Partly, if I'm honest, because some instinct told me it was a door better left closed, one of those family mysteries that exists precisely because everyone silently agreed, at some point, that peace was worth more than answers, and unpicking it might cost more than I was prepared to pay at 17, with a curfew fight still ringing in my ears. Sitting at my kitchen counter with a key and a number stamped into brass, 8 years later, I understood, for the first time, that the door might be about to open whether I was ready or no. George's first theory turned out to be half right and half wrong, which in retrospect feels like the appropriate ratio for how the rest of this story went. We started with banks, because it seemed like the most obvious place to check, and because Georgia had, with alarming speed, already drafted a script for what I should say if a teller asked questions, complete with a printed-out backup story about helping an elderly relative locate misplaced documents that she insisted I memorize before we walked into the first branch. There were exactly 3 banks within a reasonable driving distance of Aunt Viv's house that still maintained physical safe deposit boxes. Most had phased them out over the last decade, a fact Georgia delivered with genuine disappointment, as though the modernization of banking infrastructure had been designed personally to inconvenience her investigation, muttering something about digital banking ruining an entire category of mystery as we pulled out of the first bank's parking lot. The first bank had never heard of anyone named Vivian Callahan. The teller was polite but firm, checking twice, clearly used to fielding this exact kind of inquiry from confused relatives and having to disappoint them gently. The second bank's boxes used a different key style entirely, longer, with a distinctive double notch I could see clearly wasn't a match. The second the teller pulled a sample out from behind the counter to compare, holding it next to mine on the counter with the patient, slightly amused expression of someone who does this comparison more often than you'd expect. The third bank was where things got interesting, though not in the way we expected. Vivian Callahan, the branch manager repeated, typing into her computer with the particular slowness of someone double-checking before delivering unwelcome news, her eyes flicking between the screen and my face like she was weighing how much to say. "I'm sorry, we did have a box under that name, but it was closed out." "Let me see. It looks like it was closed almost 20 years ago." 2006, closed how? I asked, leaning forward despite myself. "Emptied and cancelled, or, emptied and cancelled, yes. I can't share details beyond that without the account holder present, I'm sorry. Bank policy, even for family." We sat in the car afterward, deflated, key sitting uselessly in the cup holder between us, the afternoon sun making the old brass glint in a way that felt almost mocking. 20 years, Georgia said slowly, working through it out loud, the gears visibly turning behind her eyes, one finger tapping against the steering wheel in the particular rhythm she gets when a theory is assembling itself faster than she can voice it. "Ivy. If she closed a box 20 years ago, and she's giving you a key today. This key doesn't open a safe deposit box that still exists. Or, wait. She sat up straighter, twisting in her seat to face me fully. Unless this isn't the key to the box she closed. What if this is the key to a different box, a box she opened right after, using a different bank, and never told anyone about? Why would she close one and immediately open another somewhere else? Georgia looked at me with the specific gravity of a woman who reads estate disputes for a living, the playful energy from earlier in the day suddenly gone. Because whatever she moved out of that first box in 2006, she wanted it somewhere nobody in your family would ever accidentally stumble across it again. Ivy, that's not random. That's a deliberate relocation. People don't do that unless something's changed. Unless a threat's appeared. Unless somebody got close to finding out. Something cold settled in my stomach, the particular chill of realizing a mystery is larger and older than you'd initially assumed, and older, I was beginning to suspect, than either of us had bargained for when we'd set out that morning, treating the whole thing like a fun weekend puzzle. I decided, in the end, to skip the rest of George's banking theories and go straight to the source, mostly because I'd started losing sleep over it, the key sitting on my nightstand every night like a small patient question, and partly because some instinct told me Aunt Viv had never intended for this to be a scavenger hunt. She'd intended for me to come ask her directly, eventually. Once I'd had time to sit with the strangeness of the moment and prove, I suspected, that I actually wanted the answer badly enough to go looking for it. I drove out to her house on a Tuesday evening, unannounced, the key sitting in my coat pocket the whole drive like a stone I couldn't put down, my palms damp on the steering wheel in a way that made me feel, absurdly, like I was the one about to confess to something. Aunt Viv answered the door in a cardigan and reading glasses pushed up into her white hair, Norman winding suspiciously around her ankles and eyeing me with the particular disdain he reserves for anyone who isn't her, and took one look at my face before I'd said a single word. "You've had it 3 weeks," she said, not quite a question, stepping back to let me in, the porch light catching the lines around her eyes in a way that made her look, for a moment, older and more tired than I usually let myself notice. "I wondered how long you'd sit on it before you came asking. I tried to figure it out myself first. Georgia has theories. A lot of theories, actually. We went to 3 different banks." Aunt Viv laughed, a real laugh, warm and surprised, and for a second she looked 20 years younger, and I got a small, unexpected glimpse of the woman she must have been decades ago, before whatever this was had settled into her like a permanent weight she'd learned to carry without letting it show. "You went to banks? Ivy, I could have saved you the gas money. Sit down. I suppose it's time." We sat at her kitchen table, the same worn oak table I remembered from childhood visits, Norman installing himself directly on top of my feet with the proprietary confidence of a cat who has never once doubted his right to do so, and Aunt Viv folded her hands in front of her the way people do when they've rehearsed something in their head many times and are finally, actually saying it out loud, her eyes fixed somewhere past my shoulder, on the middle distance, the way people look when they're seeing a memory instead of a room. "Your grandmother, my sister, Eleanor, was not always the woman you remember from your childhood," she began, her voice steady but quieter than her usual register, as though the story itself demanded a different volume. "Before she married your grandfather, she was engaged to someone else. A man named Thomas Whitfield. They were together for almost 3 years, and everyone in the family, myself included, assumed they'd marry. I was there the night he proposed, actually, a little lake house our family used to rent every summer, long since sold. I remember exactly what she was wearing." "What happened?" "Your great-grandfather happened. He didn't approve. Thomas came from a family with considerably less money, and back then, that mattered to my father in a way I'm ashamed of to this day, ashamed enough that I've never fully forgiven him for it, God rest his soul. He forbade the marriage. Threatened to cut Eleanor off entirely if she went through with it, not just financially, socially, completely, the way families could do to each other back then in a small town where everyone knew everyone's business. And Eleanor, who I loved dearly but who I will also tell you plainly was never the bravest of us, broke it off. Married your grandfather 8 months later. A good, steady, entirely unremarkable man who never once made her laugh the way Thomas did, not in 40 years of marriage, though I don't think she ever once complained about it out loud, not to me, not to anyone. I sat very still, feeling the shape of something large beginning to form out of the fog, Norman's weight warm and heavy across my feet, the kitchen clock ticking somewhere behind me with a loudness it hadn't had a minute earlier. But here is the part nobody in this family has ever said out loud, Ivy, not once, in over 50 years. Eleanor was already pregnant when she married your grandfather. 2 months along. And the baby wasn't his. I did the math, sitting at that kitchen table, faster than I wanted to. My mother. No, Aunt Viv said gently, reaching across to pat my hand, sensing, I think, how fast my mind had started racing toward the wrong conclusion. Not your mother. Your mother came 3 years later, entirely your grandfather's daughter, no question about it, I promise you that much. I'm talking about a child before her. A boy. Eleanor gave birth to him quietly, 6 months into the marriage. Everyone was told he came early, a small scandal about timing that got smoothed over the way these things did back then, a few raised eyebrows at church and nothing more, and your grandfather raised him as his own for the first 4 years of that boy's life, believing, as far as I ever knew, that the boy was his. He doted on him, Ivy. I want you to know that. Whatever came after, for those 4 years, that little boy had a father who adored him completely. What happened to him? Thomas found out. Somehow, I never got the full story of how. Eleanor never told me everything, even after all our years as sisters, and some of it, I suspect, she never let herself examine too closely even in her own head. Thomas found out he had a son, and he came for him. Not maliciously. He wasn't trying to steal a child out of spite. He'd never stopped loving Eleanor, never married anyone else himself in all those years, and when he learned the truth, he simply couldn't stay away. There was a terrible, quiet fight, lawyers involved, your great-grandfather threatening everyone with everything he had left to threaten with by that point, though by then his money and his influence had both shrunk considerably from their peak. In the end, Eleanor let the boy go. Let Thomas raise him, out of state, under a different name, a clean break so your grandfather could go on believing what he needed to believe, so the family name stayed protected, so nothing about it ever had to be spoken of again. I've always believed it broke something in her that never fully mended, Ivy, whatever face she showed the rest of us. And the 2 missing years, I said slowly, the pieces sliding together with a click I could almost physically feel. When I was 9. Aunt Viv's face changed, softened into something sadder, her hands tightening slightly around mine. That boy, a man by then, Ivy, in his 60s, found me. Not your mother, not the rest of the family. Me, specifically, because I was the only one who'd ever quietly kept in touch with Thomas over the decades, the only one who knew the truth had survived somewhere, a handful of letters exchanged maybe twice a year, just enough to know he was alive and well. He'd found some old letters after his father passed, pieced together who his birth mother really was, and he wrote to me, asking, very gently, very carefully, whether it might be possible to know his sister. Your mother. What did you do? I told your mother. I had to. It felt monstrous to keep it from her any longer, now that he'd found us, now that a real, living person was asking, politely and patiently, to simply be acknowledged. And your mother, God love her, Ivy, but grief does strange things to people, and she'd only lost Eleanor 4 years earlier, the wound still fresh enough to bleed at the wrong touch. She couldn't handle it. Not the existence of a half-brother, not what it meant about her own mother, not the timing of it landing 4 years after Eleanor had already passed and couldn't explain herself, couldn't sit across a table and answer for any of it. She shut down completely. Refused contact. Told the rest of the family it was a scam, a stranger trying to worm his way into an inheritance, which I knew, absolutely, was not true, but I couldn't force her to believe me, not when believing it meant reopening a grief she'd only just learned to carry. That was the fight, Ivy. That's why we skipped the reunion those 2 years. Your mother and I weren't speaking, and I wasn't willing to sit at a family party pretending everything was fine when I knew there was a man out there, my own nephew, wondering if anyone in this family would ever want to know him. I sat there, Norman's weight warm and oblivious across my feet, the kitchen clock still ticking too loudly, and felt the whole architecture of my family quietly rearrange itself into a shape I hadn't known existed, walls I'd walked past my entire life turning out to have rooms behind them nobody had ever shown me. So the key, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. What's in the box, Aunt Viv? Everything, she said simply. Every letter Eleanor and Thomas ever wrote each other, going back to before either of them married anyone else. The letters he wrote me over the years since he found us. Photographs. A ring Eleanor never got to wear. And his current address, Ivy, because he's still alive. 84 years old, living 2 states over, and as far as I know, still wondering, every single year, whether anyone in this family ever wanted to find him back. Why give this to me? I asked, once I'd absorbed enough of it to form a coherent sentence again, my throat tight, my hands still tangled loosely with hers on the table. Why not tell my mother directly, again, now, all these years later? Why hand it to me in secret at a family reunion like something out of a spy movie, of all the ways you could have done this? Aunt Viv squeezed my hand, her grip surprisingly strong for a woman her age. Because I'm 81, Ivy, and I've started forgetting things. Small things, mostly, so far, where I put my glasses, what day it is sometimes, whether I've already told you a particular story, repeating myself at dinner and not realizing it until I catch the look on someone's face. But I know what that looks like. Further down the road, I watched it happen to my own mother, and I'm not willing to let this die quietly with me the way it nearly died with your grandmother, taking its rightful owner's name down into the ground with it. I asked your mother, again, gently, about 8 months ago, whether she'd be willing to hear more about it, and she shut the door just as fast as she did the first time, maybe faster. I don't think she ever will be ready on her own, and I've made my peace, mostly, with that being her choice to make about her own grief, even if I don't fully agree with it. But you didn't make peace with the story just disappearing. No, she said, and something fierce came into her voice for the first time all evening, a flash of the woman who must have argued down bank managers and lawyers decades ago on Thomas's behalf. Because it's not only her story. It's yours too, whether she's ready to claim it or not, and it's Walter's most of all, and he's waited longer than any of us for someone to finally come find him. I decided, somewhere around your last birthday, watching you argue your mother out of some perfectly reasonable worry with more patience than I've ever managed myself, that if anyone in this family was going to be brave enough to open a locked door, it was going to be you. Not because it's fair to put that on you. It probably isn't, entirely, and I've felt guilty about that more than once since the reunion. But because I trust you to handle it with more care than I was able to, and because I am simply, selfishly, too tired to carry it alone any longer, Ivy. I've been carrying it for over 50 years. I would like, before I go, to set it down somewhere safe. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling the full, strange weight of being chosen for something I hadn't asked for, in exactly the way inheritance, the emotional kind, not just the financial kind, so often works, arriving unbidden and asking to be carried anyway. Okay, I said finally. Tell me where the box is. The second bank, it turned out, was in the next county over, a small independent branch Aunt Viv had chosen specifically, she admitted with a slightly sheepish smile, because it was far enough away that nobody in this family would ever accidentally walk past it and ask questions, and small enough that the same tellers worked the counter for 15 years and never once asked me a single thing beyond how my garden's doing. Georgia came with me, because of course she did, though she'd gone unusually quiet in the car, subdued by the actual size of the story once I'd relate it to her, the true crime enthusiasm of the last 3 weeks finally giving way to something gentler and more careful, her hand finding mine at one red light without either of us commenting on it. The box, when the teller finally set it on the table in the small private room banks keep for exactly this purpose, was smaller than I'd expected, a plain gray metal container, nothing dramatic about it at all, nothing to suggest the 50 years of buried family history folded inside, no different from 100 other identical boxes stacked in that same vault holding 100 other families' quietly guarded secrets. I lifted the lid with hands that weren't entirely steady. Letters, dozens of them, tied in small bundles with ribbon gone brittle with age, my grandmother's handwriting on the outside of each bundle in a looping, careful script I recognized faintly from an old recipe box at my mother's house, the same slant, the same particular way she crossed her T's. Photographs, a young man I'd never seen before who had my grandmother's exact smile, standing beside a woman who could only have been Eleanor herself at 22, radiant, unguarded, nothing like the careful, contained woman I remembered from my own childhood, laughing at something just outside the frame, her head tipped back, one hand pressed flat against her chest like she couldn't quite believe her own happiness. A small velvet box, the ring inside it modest and old-fashioned, a thin gold band with a single small stone, nothing like the ring my grandfather had eventually given her, which I remembered from photographs as considerably grander and, I now understood with a small ache, considerably less loved. And, tucked at the very bottom, in an envelope by itself, a single sheet of paper with an address written on it in Aunt Viv's more recent handwriting, and beneath it, for words, "He is still waiting." Georgia, reading over my shoulder, was crying quietly, unashamedly, which from Georgia, who treats most emotional moments with the same brisk efficiency she brings to legal filings, told me more clearly than anything else in that room how large the moment actually was, and how far outside her usual territory of tidy paperwork and procedural theories it had traveled. I wrote to him 3 times before I sent anything. The first draft was too formal, reading back more like a legal notice than a letter, all the careful hedging of someone terrified of causing harm, full of phrases like "I am writing to inform you" that made Georgia physically wince when I read it out loud to her over the phone that night. The second draft overcorrected wildly the other direction, too emotional, too much all at once, 3 generations of buried family feeling dumped onto a stranger who deserved, I realized reading it back the next morning with fresh eyes, a gentler introduction than that. Something that didn't ask him to absorb 50 years of grief in a single paragraph before he'd even learned my name. The third draft, the one I finally sent, was short. I told him my name. I told him I was Eleanor's granddaughter, that Aunt Vivian had trusted me with a box of letters that belonged, more than anyone, to him, and that I would very much like to meet him, if he was willing, and bring them to him myself. I sealed the envelope before I could talk myself into a 4th draft, and drove it to the post office that same afternoon rather than risk it sitting on my counter overnight, gathering doubt. He wrote back within 4 days. His name was Walter. His letter was 3 pages long, and I read it standing in my own kitchen with my hands shaking the exact way Aunt Viv's key had first shaken something loose in me weeks earlier, and somewhere in the second page, reading his careful, hopeful, decades-patient handwriting, he'd clearly waited his whole life to write a letter like this one, every sentence weighed and considered. I started crying too hard to keep reading and had to call Georgia to finish it out loud to me over the phone, both of us going quiet at the same line near the end, where he'd written, simply, "I have wondered about my mother's family every single day since I learned they existed. I never once expected any of you to come looking. Thank you for proving me wrong." We met him 6 weeks later, in a small diner exactly halfway between our 2 states, Aunt Viv insisting on coming along despite my worry about the drive being too much for her, arriving in the parking lot 10 minutes before either Walter or I did, sitting in her ancient blue sedan with the radio on, waiting, her hands gripping the wheel a little tighter than necessary for a car that was already parked. I remember the specific, absurd detail of the diner itself: red vinyl booths, a laminated menu with a photo of a slice of pie on the cover that looked nothing like the actual pie eventually delivered to our table, a waitress who called everyone Han without apparent regard for age or relationship. I remember thinking, sitting there watching the door, that of all the places this reunion could have happened, a slightly run-down diner with sticky menus felt exactly right, unglamorous and real in a way that a fancier restaurant would have made feel staged. Walter turned out to have Eleanor's exact laugh. I hadn't expected that. I'd braced myself, somehow, for a stranger, for someone whose face and voice would carry no trace of the family I'd grown up in, some blank template of a man I'd have to work to connect to anything I already knew. Instead, I sat across a diner booth from a man who laughed at his own jokes exactly the way my grandmother used to, a small private chuckle before the punchline even landed, and felt something in my chest crack open in the best possible way, watching Aunt Viv reach across the table within the first 5 minutes and grip his hand like she was making sure he was real. He'd brought his own box, it turned out, smaller than ours, a shoebox really, containing a handful of items his father Thomas had kept until the end, a photograph of Eleanor that Thomas had carried in his wallet for 60 years, worn soft at the corners, a single pressed flower from what Walter believed, based on a note tucked beside it, was the lake house where Thomas had proposed, and a short, unsent letter, dated only 3 weeks before Thomas died, addressed simply to Eleanor's family. Whoever finds this, that neither Walter nor Aunt Viv could get through reading aloud without their voices breaking. We stayed in that diner for almost 4 hours, long past when our coffee had gone cold and the lunch rush had come and gone around us, the waitress eventually just leaving the pot on our table and telling us to help ourselves, clearly sensing, in the way good waitresses always do, that something important was unfolding in her booth and that the polite thing to do was simply let it happen undisturbed. At one point, somewhere in the 3rd hour, Walter reached into his shoebox and pulled out one more item he'd saved for last, a small tin whistle, tarnished with age, that he explained had been his father's, a thing Thomas had apparently carried in his coat pocket for decades, though Walter had never once heard him play it. I always assumed it was just a habit, an old man's superstition, carrying some trinket around, Walter said, turning it over in his weathered hands. It wasn't until after he passed that I found a note tucked inside the case it came in. Just 3 words, in his handwriting. She loved this. He looked up at Aunt Viv. Did she? Play, I mean? Aunt Viv's eyes filled instantly. Badly, she said, laughing through the tears. Spectacularly badly. She used to torture the whole family with it every summer at that lake house. I'd forgotten completely until just now. I haven't thought about that whistle in 50 years, and here it is, sitting on this table like it's been waiting the whole time too. It was a small thing, a battered tin whistle worth nothing to anyone outside that booth, and it undid all three of us more thoroughly than any of the letters had, because it was proof, small and undeniable, that the love between Eleanor and Thomas hadn't just lived in solemn, tragic letters written across decades of separation. It had lived in something as ordinary and silly as a badly played summer whistle, in jokes and noise and the everyday texture of two people who'd simply loved being near each other, robbed of the chance to build an entire lifetime out of moments exactly that small. By the time we finally stood to leave, hugging in the parking lot in a tangle that somehow included all three of us at once, the tin whistle now safely in my own coat pocket, promised to Walter's grandchildren but lent to me first, so the story travels back to the family it started in, I understood that whatever this reunion cost any of us in old grief stirred back up, it was going to be worth infinitely more in the years we had left to make up for the ones we'd lost. I have to tell you about Whitney, because it would be dishonest to leave her out entirely, and because her reaction, when I finally worked up the nerve to tell her the whole story over coffee a few weeks after the diner meeting, surprised me more than almost anything else in this entire saga. I'd braced myself for judgment. Whitney has never been shy about opinions, and I expected some version of the same skepticism she'd later voice near the drink cooler, a raised eyebrow, a pointed comment about strangers and inheritances, the kind of casual cruelty she's capable of when she feels a family narrative is moving somewhere she hasn't personally approved. Instead, she went quiet for a long moment, turning her coffee cup slowly on its saucer, and then said something I didn't expect at all. You know, Uncle Bruce told me once, years ago, drunk at somebody's wedding, that there'd been a scandal in the family generations back, something to do with your grandmother, and that nobody was ever supposed to talk about it. I always just assumed it was something boring. An affair, maybe, or money. I never once imagined an entire missing sibling. She looked up at me, and for a second the performing, curated version of Whitney I'd known my whole life fell away, replaced by someone younger and more uncertain. Do you think there's more of us out there? Other doors nobody's opened yet? I don't know, I admitted. I hadn't thought about it that way. I think about it a lot, actually. How much of what we think we know about a family is just the parts everyone agreed to keep talking about? She was quiet again, then added, almost shyly, in a tone I'd genuinely never heard from her before, I'd like to meet him. Walter. If that's something people are doing. It was, I realized, watching her, the first completely unguarded thing I'd heard Whitney say in over a decade, and it recalibrated something in how I thought about her for good, a reminder that the performance she puts on near the drink cooler is, like most performances, covering for something underneath it that nobody had bothered to ask about directly. I want to be honest about this part too, because it wasn't easy, and it wasn't immediate, and it isn't a story where every wound closes neatly just because the truth finally came out into the light. I told my mother everything, for months after that first reunion hug, sitting across from her at her own kitchen table with the same careful, rehearsed steadiness Aunt Viv had used with me, having practiced the conversation in my head so many times on the drive over that the actual words, when they finally came, felt strangely rehearsed and raw at the same time. She cried. She got angry, not at me, mostly, though some of it landed there too, the old, unfair habit families have of aiming grief at whoever's closest when the real target is a person long gone or too complicated to be angry at directly. She left the room twice and came back both times, which I took, eventually, as its own kind of answer, a small, stubborn refusal to let the conversation end on the worst note. She didn't meet Walter that day, or that month. It took nearly a year, actually, slow and halting, a handful of tentative phone calls before an actual meeting, my mother rehearsing what she'd say to her half-brother with the same nervous energy I remembered from watching her rehearse difficult conversations my whole childhood, drafting and redrafting a first phone call the way I'd drafted and redrafted my first letter. Some things, apparently, running in families whether anyone intends them to or not. But she did, eventually, meet him. I wasn't in the room for that first meeting. Some things, I understood by then, needed to happen without an audience, needed the privacy that Eleanor herself had never quite been allowed, but I saw her afterward, and there was something loosened in her face that I hadn't seen in years, maybe ever, the particular relief of a person finally setting down a weight they didn't know they'd been carrying their entire life, a weight inherited without her ever having agreed to it. He has Mom's laugh, she told me that night, and started crying again, but a different kind of crying than I'd seen from her before, not the tight, controlled grief she'd carried around for decades, but something looser, something with room in it for both the sadness and, underneath it, a real and growing joy. Walter came to this year's Callahan family reunion. It took some doing. Aunt Viv coordinated most of it, quietly delighted in a way that made her look a full decade younger, spending an entire week on the phone with relatives explaining, patiently, over and over, exactly who Walter was and why he mattered, and Whitney, predictably, had opinions about a stranger showing up to a family event, opinions she voiced loudly near the drink cooler until my mother, of all people, shut her down with a single sentence I will treasure for the rest of my life. He's not a stranger, Whitney. He's my brother. Get him a plate. I watched Walter stand in that backyard, 84 years old, meeting cousins and second cousins and a whole tangle of relatives he'd spent 60 years not knowing existed, patiently answering the same handful of curious questions over and over with more grace than I think I'd have managed in his position, and I watched Aunt Viv stay for the entire party, not 90 minutes, not her usual timed exit, but the whole afternoon, well past dessert, laughing louder than I'd ever heard her laugh. Normanless and unhurried, finally, after 50 years, free of the weight she'd carried alone for most of her life. Near the end of the party, she found me by the garage again, same spot as the year before, and pressed something small into my hand a second time. I looked down, half expecting another key, another mystery, another decades-old secret waiting to unfold, my heart doing a strange, anticipatory lurch. It was a photograph. Eleanor and Thomas, young and unguarded, the one from the safe deposit box, except this copy had been reframed, a small brass plate at the bottom engraved with 2 words, "Finally home." "You did good, kid," Aunt Viv said, patting my cheek the way she used to when I was small. "Better than I could have, I think. Better than any of us managed, for 50 years. I still have the original key. It sits in a small dish on my dresser now, next to my house keys and car keys, a small, unremarkable piece of brass that once held 50 years of family silence locked inside a metal box in a bank 2 counties over, and now, somehow, holds nothing at all except the memory of everything it used to guard. I've learned, since that reunion, that families keep more locked away than any of us realize, not always in boxes, not always with actual keys, but locked away all the same, in silences everyone agrees not to break, in questions everyone's decided aren't theirs to ask, in rooms nobody quite admits exist until somebody, finally, tired enough or brave enough or simply stubborn enough, decides to go looking. And I've learned that sometimes it only takes one person willing to hold the key a little too long, a little too seriously, to finally let something back out into the light where it always deserved to be. If someone presses something small and unexplained into your hand and asks you to trust them, take it seriously. Not every secret is meant to stay buried. Some of them are just waiting for someone brave enough, or stubborn enough, to finally go looking, and to carry what they find with more care than the family that buried it in the first place. Thank you for staying till the end.